This is the Get Global Young Professionals Talk Global Health podcast, envisioned and created by the Irish Global Health Network and their student outreach team. I am your host, Megan Davis, Communications and Events Intern at the Irish Global Health Network and second-year medical student at the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland. In this series, join me and my student outreach team co-host Aidan Desjardins, a microbiology student at Trinity College, as we talk to inspiring young professionals leading the charge in their respective fields, often operating in sidelines to their career, following their passions above all.
Today we are looking forward to speaking to Ngozi Elobuike. Here's a segment from our conversation.
What is this knowledge that we've eaten and consumed and devoured wholesale? Why aren't we challenging it? Why aren't we thinking about how these powers that be are wanting us to devour it without questioning it?
A global health scholar and cultural broker, Ngozi has an insatiable taste for examining power, asymmetries, strategic problem solving, and developing human potential. Currently, she is a race, migration, and decolonial studies M.A. student at the University College Dublin and has a B.S. in biology from Howard University and an M.S.c. in global health and development from University College London. To add, she is a trained activist that has traveled far to lead a grassroots project in Malawi in Africa around youth development and has also brought her project management skills to community organizing in her hometown of Stockton, California. As a champion of critical thought, decolonizing diversity, equality, inclusion, and community-centered praxis are her forte. Welcome to the podcast, Ngozi.
Thank you so much for having me. It is such a pleasure to be here.
So we like to begin by asking our guests how and what started their journey in global health. So would you mind sharing your story?
Yes, I can definitely share it. I feel like I started off in global health the way most people do, and that's through like the pre-medical path. So I'm Nigerian American. And as most Nigerian Americans know, or Nigerian people in general in the diaspora know, you have only a few select options for a professional career. You're either a doctor, a lawyer, engineer, or bust. If you're, feeling wild, you can be an accountant. And so my parents had set me up on the track to love sciences, and it led me down the pathway into majoring in biology. So I attended Howard University, and I was a biology major, and I was at that time on the pre-medical path. And in the first month I was on campus, I was approached by this amazing young scholar, I would just call her Christina Muta, and she wanted to start a global health organization on campus. Me, eager, young, with an appetite for leadership, I decided I wanted to join, and that was the start to my global health journey, that global health organization called GlobeMed.
That's really amazing innovation. And I know we're going to be talking about decolonization. So would you mind describing decolonization? Just teach our listeners a little bit for context.
Yeah, so I can definitely get in trouble with decolonial scholars for my definition, so I'll keep it very loose. So decolonization is a process, it's an action, it's a verb and a praxis. So there's a couple of different words swirling around the field. There's post-colonialism, right? There's anti-colonialism, there's decolonization. And so when we focus on decolonization, it is the process of removing relics of colonial authorities from any space, discipline, or country. In the context of what I'll be talking about is decolonizing or removing, the remnants of colonial authorities from the global health space, but you can also decolonize a country, a political system, etc.
So what sort of structures of coloniality or colonial inheritances are currently present in global health?
How much time do we have? There are way too many to name, to be honest. I'd say the most prevalent ones that we see exist in the funding landscape. A lot of foreign aid and health interventions are delivered from the top down in arguably paternalistic way. And so when we look back at the structure of colonialism, right, the 1885 Scramble for Africa was the perfect example of what the colonial project aimed to do: divide and conquer. And so what it did seamlessly was, number one, enter and invade these systems, categorize and divide people, institute a new way of being, right? A new way of thinking through education, a new language, a new religion, a new social, economic, and political system designed to drain resources from the colony, from the periphery, as people say, into the metropole. So we don't have to look too hard at the global health landscape to see in what ways have these structures been replicated. In what ways do we see the USAID delivering health interventions from the top down, wanting to have a say in the way that funding is distributed, and relying on information from the West to guide what happens on the ground in non-Western spaces. So I'll leave it at that for now. Yeah.
Some in the aid field in global health have the mindset that non-Western spaces can't really go about this change and deliver this aid by themselves. What would be your response to that?
Yeah, so I want us to take a second to look at something I'm going to call the world systems theory. It is a Marxist theory, so let's just put it out there, okay? And it's going to be accented by something called the codependency theory. And so basically what these theories say is that at the center you have, the core. Around the center, and this is when it comes to world structures, around the center you have the semi-periphery, and at the end you have the periphery. And so what happens in this structure, right, is that you have at the core, you have the creation of final products, right? And these final products and goods are not created simply in the core. Rather, the periphery, right, is where the raw materials necessary for developing these final products, goods, services, et cetera, come from. They get exported into the core, right? The periphery exports goods or into the core. They get turned into final materials and then sold back out to the core, right? And so this, theory, world systems theory, is also complemented by the codependency theory, one that says development as we see it now, industrialization as we see it now, would never have been possible without colonialism. Never, ever. The goods, the resources, the material, even if you take all of those, like the physical material away, simply the potential for human power and innovation, which is driven by the movement of people as capital, right? Like human capital, chattel slavery, like all of these things would never have been possible without the creation of these systems. And so we then, right, to understand that is arguably the way in which the world systems as we know it developed, then we ask ourselves, okay, well, if the periphery was not autonomous, did not have full autonomy over their own resources in terms of human capacity, in terms of minerals, in terms of resources, et cetera, what did they lose and what do they continue to lose, right? The cost is incalculable. You could never go back and figure out how much it would be. It's what is it like? It's a rhetorical question to ask, to be frank. And then we ask, well, why don't they have the capacity then to deliver health interventions in a way that is sustainable? Why are their political systems perpetually corrupt? I'll put that in quotes because that's a whole nother conversation we don't have time for. Why are they incompetent, right? And so part of it is because of the way that the world system is created, right? Colonialism wasn't concerned with creating sustainable structures necessary for people to develop their own societies. The roads and transportation and infrastructure was to take minerals from the site of extraction and extract it as far as it can get out to west. It was not concerned with lighting villages. It was concerned with extraction. And so all the infrastructure reflects it till this day. And work is in place to make sure that, infrastructure is developed in Africa, but the legacy of colonialism is entirely too recent. And to be frank, 1960s were when most West African countries truly gained independence. And so 50, 60 years is nothing it's a blink of an eye in a historical timeline. The last thing I want to say on this point is that the colonial project also, right, in the way that it's created, has its own set of propaganda and rhetoric. And one of the biggest points is the idea of the colonized as savage, brutal, and incapable of, intellectual thought, right? You would then have, as a colonizer, have to go into the colony and bring religion, make these barbaric people and primitive people civil. It's a civilizing project, but that's a myth, right? We don't have to go too far to look at places, in Africa and India that have had Sanskrit, and other forms of advanced society to know that the civilizing project is a myth. But I'll leave it there. And then, of course, all these things play into the global health space around people and their own capacity to care for themselves and their communities, et cetera. Yeah.
No, thank you. I'm really loving your passion and your energy. So the next question, you kind of touched on it a bit. It's a loaded one, so feel free to break it down. How do gaze, language, and authorship reflect power asymmetries?
Yeah. And so as, global health scholars, practitioners, academicians, et cetera, right? What is it like? We don't exist in a vacuum, right? We're learning, we think we're learning to help the world, to save people. Everything that we are experiencing in our own learning journeys has to be decolonized, using decolonize as an action. The first thing that we can look at is like how authorship in global health reflects asymmetry. So if you look at, and Global Health 50/50 put out a report in 2020 to show where power in global health leadership lies. And if you look at it, I don't want to misquote it, but 8%, right? It was a less than 10%, right, of global health leadership lies in low to middle income countries. And most of those people leading global health are from high income countries. They are oftentimes white men. And surprisingly, most of them have gone to Harvard. So if you want, if you're looking at how you can increase your odds of being a global health leader, be a white man who's gone to Harvard, right? Ironically or unironically. And so then we look at, papers published, and a huge margin, over 90% of global health papers that are written about low to middle income countries do not include authors of low to middle income countries as the first author. And if you even look further, like it's only a slightly higher percentage that will have them as authors at all, maybe second, middle, definitely not last author. And so we know that who is writing about global health are not the people who are experiencing at the tail end or the recipients of interventions. And thus and therefore they're not leading the charge on research. To add to that, right, language is really important. Oftentimes in the global health space, we say global south, global north. I think thankfully a lot of us have moved away from saying third world. I'm tired of that term. But the way in which we describe people from most affected places and areas is really important because it reflects beliefs, ideologies, etc. And the last thing that I'll say is gaze is something that was really, really strongly discussed by Toni Morrison, who is an African-American author, who talks about how debilitating the white gaze is for the Black writer, how the white gaze fixes you in place, doesn't allow, any nuance. It tells you who you are, what you have the capacity to do. And when you write for the white gaze, you write with a tone of voice that is none of your own. Dr. Shea Abimbola, who is a global health practitioner, went on to say that not only is there white gaze, there is foreign gaze. And when local, activists and researchers have to write for foreign audiences, it can be corrupting. You're not writing in a way that is truly responsive to what is happening on the ground, nor are you writing for your community. So I think we often have to ask ourselves, what is this knowledge that we've eaten and consumed and devoured wholesale? Why aren't we challenging it? Why aren't we thinking about why, how these powers that be are wanting us to a certain extent to devour it without questioning it. So that's it.
With that in mind, what steps should burgeoning global health practitioners take to decolonize themselves and their praxis?
Yeah, that's a really good one. Number one, I don't know, am I allowed to curse on here? Like, call out your own bullshit. Come on now. What did is the Outcast say? Like, I know you like to think your shit doesn't stink. It does. It does. It does. Like, we are all in some way, shape, or form complicit in these structures that we hate, right? Like, but there's this really good quote that I read that was like, we are all forced to participate like in capitalism in some way, shape, or form. And it's because we are forced to participate in it that we are allowed to critique it, right? So it's because we are forced to be a part of a deeply colonial system that we're allowed to critique it. The first step for any global health practitioner is figuring out where the origins of global health are. If you don't understand how tropical medicine was started, if you don't understand imperial hygiene and how the first systems of global or international health were started because colonialists wanted a way to keep themselves healthy, and literally infect native populations with disease, by like they did things like passing out infected blankets and things like that, then you truly, aren't really aware of what you're doing in the field. So that's step one, be a historian of your discipline. Step two would be to question the reasons why you want to do things, be self-reflective. This is more of an ethical consideration. Some ethicists say that no one ever does things just, to be a good person. We all have, in some way, shape, or form, self-interested motivations that propel us to do things in life. So, figure out what is your motivation to be a global health practitioner. Are you aiming to be a savior? Not even just a white savior, a savior of any sort. If so, yeah, you might want to rethink it. And then the last one is diversify your knowledge base. Get as much information as possible from as many sources as possible. There's this quote that says, the fool believes that he's wise, and the wise man believes that he will always be a fool. Like, consider yourself a fool, especially when it comes to what you think you know about communities.
So last question, how have movements for decolonizing global health developed?
Oh, that's a good one. So I think the movement for decolonization in and of itself began, I would say it began, it's hard to find the site of origin, because there were so many different revolutions that cropped up very early on. We could look at the Haitian Revolution led by Toussaint and say, like, that was, the creation of the first Black nation. That was decolonization through and through. We could look at the 1960s, when all these countries in West Africa, but also, in other parts of the world were, ridding themselves of colonial authorities. You could say that was the inception of, true decolonization and decolonization wars. But I think I'll go and cite what happened at the University of Cape Town during the creation of fallism. Fallism is a decolonial tool, option, way of thinking, ideology. And what happened was a group of students basically brought down a statue of in Cape Town, South Africa. And that movement was to decolonize the university. And so that's when I feel like concretely decolonization came into academics. So in terms of global health, though, I think 2020 offered us some really good traction. I've never seen as many global health decolonization movements until September of 2020, which is great. But it's still a work in progress. It's still a work in progress. I would say the moment is happening now. So, yeah.
That's wonderful. And I want to leave the space open for anything else that you'd like to touch on before we wrap up.
Yeah, I think the most important part, what allows you to do the best decolonial work is to decenter yourself. Eurocentrism is concerned with the I and the individual, and everything is kind of like, am I doing the right thing? Am I doing the right work? Am I being a hypocrite? All these questions that crop up, right? Like, leave all that behind, focus on, the people and the populations and the policy. And I'm trying to think of more things that start with P, the things outside of yourself that create, the biggest, I guess, impact. And think about the ways in which you can radically reimagine systems and structures, because that is decolonization. Radical imagination is decolonization brought to life. So, yeah.
So are there any resources or websites that our listeners can visit to learn more and to get involved?
Yes. We're going to start with Sunu Journal. So Sunu Journal was started by Amy Sal, who is described as a cultural entrepreneur. I love that word, a cultural entrepreneur. And a lecturer. She is absolutely amazing. She has created a compendium, or I suppose it's a journal, like an archive called Sunu Studies. And on it, she has copies of some of the most brilliant decolonial texts. You can find Amina Cesare's A Dying Colonialism. You can find books by Frantz Fanon. You can find just about anything. So start there. That's a really important resource. Because those books are also free to access. Start at the community level, start at the fringes, right? Start with the most unconventional, quote unquote, books, texts, and movies, and let them radically let them disturb your current thoughts of the norm, and then you can start working backwards. So if you are a person who is challenging the ways in which you exist in the world, go to literature and film produced by somebody who has a completely different, almost completely counter lived experience than you. Start there and work backwards. I'm trying to think of other. BMJ Global Health is really good, run by Shea Abimbola, the doctor of global health that I mentioned before. I can't think of any resources right now off the top of my head anymore, but maybe I'll send it to y'all and you guys can include it in the chat.
That's perfect. We can add it in a description of the episode for sure.
Lovely.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast, Ngozi. What an absolutely fantastic conversation. We encourage you all to visit the resources mentioned in this episode, and also to visit www.globalhealth.ie for more information about the Irish Global Health Network and our student outreach team. Thank you for tuning in.
Thank you. Have a good one. It was so good to be in conversation.